Hi, in this video we are going to have a look at the accounting entries. Mainly, accounting entries are composed of two different concepts. The accounting entry itself, we call that sometimes a journal entry. It just represents a transaction that usually was also in the form of a document, so it could have been an invoice, payment, a receipt. And as you can see here, there's always at least two lines, one for the debit and one for the credit. And also the sum of all the credits and all the debits of the same accounting entry must be always balanced. And inside the journal entry, what you will usually find is you will have some header information, but then you will have lines, and those lines are what we call journal items. And these journal items usually only have an amount for the credit or for the debit, but not for both. And usually in the same accounting entry you will have at least one journal item for the credit and one journal item for the debit. We are going to see that in a few seconds. So let's create our first journal entry. It will be created, the first one, from an invoice. If I go to the customer invoices and then click on create, I will just key in my first invoice for today. You can see that here I'm just selecting the same product as before. And what is important is that you will see that in the other info tab there is no reference yet to the journal entry. That's quite simple. There is no journal entry yet. In fact, the journal entry will be generated once I validate the invoice. So if you can see here, I'm clicking on validate and then the journal entry appears and I can click on that journal entry in order to access the information that it contains. On this screen, we can see both of the concepts we showed earlier in this video. You have the journal entry that is here and the header information where you can see the journal, the date, and the sequence, well, the number of this entry. And then you have all the items here that are composing the entry. And you can see that for every entry you will always have the debits, the sum of debits matching the sum of credits. I told you that usually every entry is linked to a document. In our case here the document is the invoice. And let's imagine I made a mistake by creating this invoice for any reason, the amount is incorrect or the tax is incorrect, and I already sent that document to my customer. I can create a refund invoice. Mention there was an error. And then on that refund, if I validate, you'll see of course this will create on its turn an entry. And here, of course, the debit and the credit are not the same because we reverted the entry, kind of. What is important to understand is that in Odoo you'll have a lot of accounting entries being generated. You can find them all under Advisor Journal Entries, and you can see that here by default it's filtering on miscellaneous operations. But of course there are tons of operations that can lead to the creation of journal entries. Among which, of course, invoices and payments, point of sale tickets, expenses for your employees, eventually also journal entries in your stock journals if you selected that you wanted to have a perpetual inventory, entries for amortization and deferred revenues, or even employee expenses. But for now, let's create first a miscellaneous entry. And you'll see that the difference here is that I won't have the entry generated automatically by a document we created in Odoo, but I will rather create the journal entry from scratch. So maybe I have a document that shows that I would need to create a journal entry, but it is not represented. That document cannot be represented by Odoo. So we have invoices, we have tickets, but here for, let's say, salaries entries or provisions, we don't have that kind of document, so usually we create a journal entry manually. So let's create my first journal entry in my miscellaneous journal. I click on create. You can see that the adequate journal is selected. I will say that this is for a provision. It's always better to give a reference to your manual entries. And I will create at least 2 lines here by selecting the add to provisions. And I will repeat the same information here, give some amount to the credits, and the same will be done here for the debit part of my entry. As both lines have the same amount here, you can see that the entry is balanced, and so I could post it. This brings me to another point we didn't discuss before. When I created an invoice, you can see that by default the entry was posted automatically. That's because I already had some step of validation. I could click on validate on the invoice, and then the accounting entry was created and automatically validated. Here, as it's a manual entry and I still want to maybe save some document in draft, it's possible. Here you can see that the document is by default unposted. Let's say a draft. You have a bit of explanation here, and I need to post it in order to take it into account in my accounting reports. And at the moment it's not posted yet, but by clicking on that button, post, I can post my journal entry. Of course, my entry will be taken immediately into account in my various reports. Let's have a look at the trial balance, for example, and you can see that here we can find the same amounts under the two accounts that have been selected on my manual entry. But eventually you can also reverse the entry if you realize that you made a mistake and you don't want to remove the information from your system. And by clicking on reverse entry, Odoo will ask you if you want to reverse at today's date or another date, and you can use maybe a specific journal, but if you don't define one, it will use the same journal, so miscellaneous here. I click reverse move, and you can see that reverse move has been selected by inverting the credit and debit for every line on the same journal, with the reference being reversal of the previous entry. As mentioned earlier, you saw that when I went to Advisor and Journal Entries, by default we filter on the miscellaneous journal. But I can remove that filter and have a look at all my operations since the beginning of Odoo. Here you can see that I have different entries for different journals, and I can filter and, for example, select all the entries for the customer invoices journal, or select all the entries for a specific partner. Of course, you have lots of other filters, but those ones are quite easy to use and grasp. Also important is that when you create an entry, let's create a new one, you will see that here it doesn't receive a number by default, but because it is not yet posted. And if I go back to journal entries, you will see it will appear in blue instead of in black, and it doesn't have a number. So you can easily find back the different operations for which you didn't yet post the entry yet, and you have already filters that are available in standard as well. What's important to understand also is that this is the most granular information that you can see about Odoo's accounting. The journal entries are quite precise about the accounting information you have, but you have even better, which are the journal items. By default, the journal items are not visible under the Advisor menu item, but once you go in debug mode, I will go here from the URL, but you could go into the technical settings in order to change that. You will see that I now have access to the journal items, which is maybe the most important part of Odoo's accounting. And here you have all different journal items mixed, whatever the journal entry they are coming from, or the journal, or the account. As we mentioned earlier, this is the place where you have the most detailed information about Odoo's accounting, and for that reason it is often based on that information that we build our reports. Let's have a look at the trial balance, for example. You'll see that in fact the trial balance is simply summing up all the different journal items for the different accounts we have here for the period that can be chosen at the top of this page. And if you change the information here, of course, it will look for more and more journal items. Well, that's it for the journal entries. We'll have a look in the next videos at the analytic accounting.